Hi everyone, it's Nick with Build Up Advisory Group, and it's Fastball Fridays, a web series where we will quickly build what you know about infrastructure design in the nonprofit sector. Today's Fastball topic is holding grant makers accountable for equity and inclusion. It's part 2 to our last Fastball Friday, episode 50. In that episode, we talked about the first of 2 recommendations to hold grant makers accountable for equity and inclusion. We shared that the first recommendation is to require them to share what they've done or are doing about equity in their grant-making processes and practices. In particular, we said that we should require every grant maker that publicly shared they were focused on equity in grant making to explain exactly what they've changed within their organization's infrastructure to make them more equitable and inclusive. Today, we're talking about the second recommendation for grant maker accountability. The second recommendation is, quite frankly, to put your money where your mouth is. Don't just talk about it, be about it. Accountability here means that we should look into budgeting and expenditures. If the only time a grant maker's advisors or consultants are people of color is when it's sourcing for DEI consultants, it needs to be held accountable. DEI is important, critical work, of course. But if the only value you see in engaging advisors who are from historically marginalized communities is when you're rolling out a new DEI initiative, that's a problem. Similarly, if you start a DEI engagement and decidedly pay those consultants less than what you would have paid for other engagements within your organization, that payment inequity will reverberate throughout your work and infrastructure. Why? Because by doing this, grant makers refuse to take equity a step further, refuse to take inclusion a step further, refuse to understand or engage with even the thought of racial justice because they've compartmentalized equity and their understanding of it. Compartmentalizing allows them to engage advisors to work within the organization to support their strategy, operations, and structuring without considering how those expenditures impact their equity commitment. And the only time they need to consider or insist on equity or inclusion is when they're in the DEI sphere. That approach is flawed, and we need to call it out whenever we see it. Look at annual information returns, websites, press releases, wherever an expenditure is shared, and call it out. If you believe in equity and justice, you should be searching for ways to be more inclusive by engaging groups that have historically been left out of the conversation, both in terms of your work and your operations. You should be looking for gaps in your own approach to the work and actually doing what you're saying publicly that you're doing. And so when I look around at grant-making institutions, organizations, ecosystems, and I don't see these efforts being reflected in their expenditures, budgeting, the way they're spending their funding, I always think, who's holding them accountable? If your expenditures and spending aren't reflective of equity, we should hold you accountable. If you're talking about inclusion and you haven't gotten to justice through your expenditures, someone needs to hold you accountable for that. When we say don't just talk about it, be about it, we're also talking about how you use your influence and leverage your positioning within the sector to support expenditures within the ecosystem in which you operate. When you have the ability to create partnerships, build fields of work, and connect other grant makers to a shared goal, but don't do so, despite your public commitment to equity and inclusion, it's signaling a larger problem within the way you work and the way that you say you work. If your partnerships with other grant makers or service providers are not equitably structured, and it could be inadvertent, it could be your quote template that has language in it that you don't even realize undermines your equity and justice commitment. It's a signal that your infrastructure is not reflective of your values. That's why we should be asking why. It helps us become clear on our equity commitments and helps us understand when a commitment is reasonable and when it's not. Accountability is not about shaming. It's about allowing us to do even better work. Hold them accountable. I know we all remember the black squares that went up after George Floyd's murder. Everyone talked about equity. Nearly everyone started equity funds. Many started grant-making programs focused on Black, Indigenous, and other people of color, but we didn't hold folks accountable for the fact that many of these funds were smaller in asset size, or that many of these opportunities were much smaller in scope than other mainstream funds set up for the same purpose, or that some grant makers actually didn't do anything at all. Releasing statements is a great start. It is not the outcome we're looking for. And until we all decide collectively to hold grant makers and each other accountable for equity and inclusion in expenditures, then we're perpetuating systemic harm. And that's our fast build. I want to hear how you are thinking about holding grant makers accountable. I would love to hear from you and about your experience in the comments below. And if you're finding these Fast Build Fridays helpful or informative, I would love it if you would like this video and hit subscribe. Thanks for watching. Have a wonderful weekend and keep building bravely.